A passenger stabbed a black baby's hand with a pencil. Seconds later, the father turned that same pencil into a moment no one could forget. He turned a child's innocent hand into a target for his cruelty. He didn't know justice was sitting inches away, waiting for his turn. Subscribe if you believe no pain inflicted on the innocent should go unanswered. Can you move your kid's hand? Ross Denning's voice cut through the cabin's low hum like a dull blade scraping metal. Dr. Malcolm Strain glanced up, startled by the sharpness. Levi, his 8-month-old son, had reached toward the edge of Ross's tray table, chubby fingers brushing against the rim. The baby's giggle had only just echoed through the cabin seconds earlier, soft and curious. "I'm sorry," Malcolm said quickly, adjusting Levi's position in his lap and gently nudging the boy's hand back toward the window. "He's just noisy," Ross interrupted, not bothering to lower his voice. "And restless. Shouldn't be on a plane this long." Malcolm gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind you offer when civility matters more than honesty. "We'll keep to ourselves." He turned his attention back to Levi, cooing softly to distract the child with a rattle clipped to the carry-on bag at his feet. The baby latched onto it with renewed fascination, shaking it with triumphant glee. Malcolm exhaled, attempting to settle his own nerves. The flight was only 2 hours, maybe 2.5. Just enough time to get some rest, perhaps go over his keynote speech once more. But a sense of unease had already crept into the seat beside him, and it wasn't from turbulence. Ross sat rigid, arms folded tightly, his jaw clenching and unclenching as he stared ahead. He wore a dark green windbreaker zipped all the way up despite the cabin's mild temperature. His left knee bounced subtly, a nervous tick or something worse, and every few seconds his eyes flicked toward Levi with something between contempt and calculation. Malcolm noticed it. He noticed everything. A surgeon didn't survive long without reading body language, pulse rhythms, and silent cues. And Ross Denning's silence said more than his words ever could. Across the aisle, a flight attendant named Jerome moved down the row, checking seatbelts. A clipboard was tucked under his arm, and he offered a courteous nod to passengers as he passed. "Would you like anything to drink, gentlemen?" Jerome asked when he reached their row. "Water, thank you," Malcolm replied. "Coffee, black," Ross said without looking up. Jerome nodded and moved on. The moment he stepped away, Ross muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Malcolm to hear. "Hope he knows how to handle that thing before it bursts into tears again." Malcolm froze for a fraction of a second, then resumed bouncing Levi on his knee. "He's not a thing." "He's my son. I figured," Ross replied coolly, "since no one else seems to be claiming him." The air between them grew dense. Malcolm leaned back slightly, adjusting Levi's blanket with slow, deliberate care. "I'm not looking for an argument." "Good," Ross said, "because you wouldn't win one." Malcolm said nothing. He stared out the window instead, letting his eyes settle on the distant grid of roads and rooftops shrinking beneath the clouds. He focused on the shifting horizon, trying to push away the anger building in his chest. But Levi's sudden giggle, another burst of joy at something unseen, pulled both men's attention back inward. Ross flinched. "I don't like babies," he said flatly, "especially loud ones." Malcolm's gaze shifted to him again, slower this time. He studied Ross's expression, noted the slight tremble in his fingers as he gripped the seat's armrest. Not just irritation, something colder, deeper. "You know," Malcolm said quietly, "you could just wear noise-canceling headphones like everyone else." Ross didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You shouldn't have brought him on this flight." The words struck like ice, not yelled, not sneered, whispered, deliberate. Malcolm stared at him now, fully. "Excuse me?" Ross's eyes were fixed ahead, but the corner of his mouth twitched with something close to a grin, tight and humorless. "Some places aren't meant for certain people. Or their noise." For the first time, Malcolm felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't irritation. It was something else, something rotting beneath the surface of civil conversation. He glanced around the cabin. No one seemed to be listening. A teenager scrolled through his phone 2 rows ahead. An older man snored behind them. Jerome had moved to the galley. He turned his attention back to his son. Levi had grown quiet, sensing the tension. His head rested against Malcolm's chest, his tiny fingers wrapping around a button on his father's shirt. Malcolm whispered, "It's okay, buddy." "We're all right." But his eyes remained on Ross. The man hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. His fingers were tapping the tray table now, softly, rhythmically. Tap, tap, tap. A subtle vibration passed through the floor as the plane leveled. The captain's voice came on overhead, cheerful and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude." Smooth skies ahead. Malcolm didn't hear the rest. His mind was spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about Ross was wrong. Not just his words or his stare, but the way he didn't flinch. The way his gaze had locked onto Levi's hands as though the child wasn't even real. Just a noise, a disturbance. And yet, Malcolm reminded himself, this could just be a man having a bad day. A sour passenger annoyed by the cries of a child. It had happened before. Often. But then Ross leaned in slightly, not turning his head, just enough so that his voice would land directly in Malcolm's ear. "You shouldn't have brought him on this flight." It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. Too calm, too certain. As if something irreversible had already begun. Malcolm shifted his body, shielding Levi more completely. His pulse ticked faster now, his mind taking inventory of the situation, not just as a father, but as a surgeon used to planning for emergencies. Window seat, one exit behind, one ahead, child strapped in. He drew a breath and held it. The baby stirred and cooed softly. Ross smiled, just faintly. The cabin lights dimmed. Outside, clouds swallowed the afternoon sun. And inside, a quiet war had begun. Not of fists or screams, but of stares, silences, and the subtle calculus of 2 men seated inches apart with the future trembling softly between them. Sometimes, danger boards quietly, disguised as civility. "Can't you keep him quiet?" The words came like a blade across the aisle, slicing through the quiet lull of the cabin as the aircraft leveled above the cloud line. Dr. Malcolm Strain turned slightly, meeting the sharp stare of the man seated beside him. Ross Denning's jaw was tight, his nostrils flared, and his eyes bore into the small bundle in Malcolm's arms, Levi, who was whimpering softly, his tiny fists rubbing at his ears as the pressurized air toyed with his senses. Malcolm offered a measured breath. "He's just adjusting to the altitude," he replied, voice calm, steady. He rocked his son gently, fingers brushing the baby's cheek. The crying wasn't constant, just scattered bursts of discomfort, normal, expected. But Ross's irritation bloomed as if the cries were sirens. "Then adjust him faster," Ross muttered under his breath, not quite loud enough for the rest of the cabin to hear, but with enough venom to make Malcolm's chest tighten. The man didn't look away. His fingers began tapping a rhythm on the shared armrest, steady, sharp, impatient. Flight attendant Jerome Pike passed by with brisk steps, glancing once at the tension between the 2 men, but his focus snapped toward the overhead display. "Fasten seatbelts," blinked. Turbulence had been forecast, and the light jostling of the plane confirmed it. Still, Jerome made a mental note and moved on, unaware that the real storm was brewing in seat 14B. Malcolm adjusted Levi's blanket and whispered soothing words. "Almost there, buddy. Just a little while more." But even as he spoke, he felt it, the narrowing of the space around him, the shift in the atmosphere. Ross was leaning closer now, body turned halfway toward them. Malcolm saw the twitch in the man's jaw, the slight flex in his fingers like someone holding back a snarl. "Shouldn't have brought him on this flight," Ross said, his voice now a whisper, but there was nothing soft about it. It was a knife dipped in calm. Malcolm's head turned slowly, eyes locking with the man's. "Excuse me?" Ross didn't blink. "You knew he'd cry. You knew he'd ruin the flight for the rest of us." Levi whimpered again, and Ross's eye twitched. "Men like you always think your time is more important than everyone else's." Malcolm didn't respond. Not right away. He stared at the man, at the too still expression, the complete absence of empathy, and then looked back down at Levi. The baby's cheeks were flushed, his eyes watery but alert. Malcolm rocked him again, just slightly, refusing to let the tension disrupt his rhythm. But inside, his thoughts weren't so calm. He's just a child. What kind of man sees a crying baby and feels hatred? The tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. Ross's knee now bounced in rhythm with his fingers, and with each pass of Jerome, the man's face would return to a mask of indifference. Malcolm's mind wandered briefly. He remembered the ER nights, the way tension built like this before a code blue. It was in the breathing, the silence before the chaos. Something wasn't right. Ross wasn't just irritated. There was a cold focus in his demeanor that didn't match normal passenger frustration. He scanned Ross's hands again. Clean, manicured nails. A wedding band tan line, though the ring was missing. His jacket, buttoned even though the plane was warm, shifted strangely when he leaned back. The sharp angle in the breast pocket looked like it held something firm. A pen, maybe, or a stylus. But the image nagged at Malcolm. Then, without warning, Ross smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It curled at the edge of his mouth like something rehearsed, fake, performed. "I used to be good with kids," he said casually, "before everything changed." Malcolm didn't answer. He simply turned his body slightly, shielding Levi more fully with his arm. The cry had faded now into sniffles, and Levi nuzzled into his chest, breathing slowly. Ross continued, voice lower now. "It's funny how people pretend children don't shape everything. One bad cry, and suddenly you see how far people are willing to go." He tilted his head slightly. "You're calm." "That's impressive." "What do you want?" Malcolm asked quietly. Ross blinked once. "Oh, nothing," he said with a slight shake of his head. "Just observing." Malcolm's hand tightened around the baby bottle. "You're too observant." The plane dipped slightly, a ripple of turbulence causing the lights to flicker. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice announced, "We're expecting light turbulence over the next 20 minutes. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened," but no one in Malcolm's row was listening. Jerome passed by once again, giving a polite but cautious look. "Everything all right over here, gentlemen?" Ross smiled again. "Just a conversation." Malcolm didn't speak. Jerome nodded awkwardly and walked on, radio clipped to his belt buzzing softly. The cabin seemed to close in tighter. The hum of the engine, the pressurized air, the low murmur of passengers, it all faded behind the pulsing awareness in Malcolm's gut. Something in Ross's words, his rhythm, his intensity. It wasn't just discomfort. It was calculated. Waiting. Malcolm focused on Levi's hand, so small, wrapped tightly in the corner of the blanket. The child shifted in his sleep, brow twitching as if disturbed by the energy in the air. Ross leaned forward again, breath shallow, words barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have brought him on this flight." And this time, the words weren't just a complaint. They were a warning. Some threats sound harmless until the sky seals you in with them. Ross moved without warning. In the quiet aftermath of turbulence, as the plane leveled and a brief calm returned to the cabin, he reached into the inner pocket of his gray wool jacket and pulled out a sharpened pencil, its wooden body darkened by age, its point disturbingly sharp. His jaw tightened. His voice was low, almost a growl, the kind that doesn't need volume to chill the spine. Maybe this will shut him up. Before Malcolm could fully register the words, Ross's arm extended with a swift, calculated jab. The pencil's tip pierced Levi's tiny palm with a sickening accuracy that seemed less like impulse and more like aim. The baby's scream, raw, high-pitched and immediate, ripped through the cabin like a blade, shattering the fragile peace and jolting passengers from their half-dozing states. Blood welled from the puncture instantly, red against brown skin, bright against the white fabric of the baby's onesie. The wound was small but vicious, the kind that left more than just a mark. For the briefest second, everything stilled. Time seemed to pause. No engine hum, no seat creaks, no voices. Just the shock of pain echoing from a child too young to understand cruelty. Malcolm's hand clutched Levi with protective instinct, pulling him close to his chest. His own heart hammered like a drum, his limbs cold, his ears roaring. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think, only feel. Every lesson of calm under pressure from the operating room blurred into something primal, ancient and protective. Ross remained in his seat, his expression unreadable but disturbingly casual. He looked at the crying baby as if annoyed by a buzzing fly. Then, in a tone that was almost mocking, he muttered, "He needed to learn discipline." That sentence fractured something in Malcolm's soul. He didn't speak, not at first. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. His eyes locked on Ross's face, memorizing it. The faint smirk, the wrinkle between his brows, the way he leaned back like he had done something clever, something deserved. Flight attendant Jerome Pike rushed up the aisle. "Sir." What just happened? His voice cracked with urgency, his eyes wide as he took in the blood on the baby's hand, the pencil in Ross's grip. Other passengers leaned over armrests, phones in hand, some recording, others frozen with disbelief. A man in a window seat whispered, "Did he just stab that baby?" Malcolm pressed a napkin against Levi's wound, applying pressure with careful fingers while murmuring softly to the wailing child. "It's okay, son. Daddy's got you," he whispered barely above the hum of the engines. His voice was steady, but inside, a storm raged. Jerome tried to wrest the pencil away from Ross, who shrugged it off like a teacher dismissing a student's complaint. He kept crying. "I fixed it," Ross said, his tone maddeningly calm. Malcolm's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable restraint of a man raised on control, discipline, and rationality, now brought to the edge by an act so senseless, so personal, it felt like an attack on the fabric of fatherhood itself. A male attendant named Devon joined Jerome, pulling Ross's tray table down to restrict his movement. "Sir, you need to stay seated," Devon said sternly, gesturing for another crew member to alert the cockpit. But Malcolm wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were on Levi's hand, blood soaking through napkin layers, the baby's cries turning into weak, breathless sobs. A child hurt not by accident, not by negligence, but by intent. "Doctor, are you okay?" Jerome asked, moving closer, his hand hovering near Malcolm's shoulder. Malcolm didn't respond. He gently adjusted the baby's blanket, kissed his damp forehead, and looked at the clock on the cabin bulkhead. The minute hand ticked, indifferent. He replayed Ross's words again in his mind. He needed to learn discipline. No remorse, no regret, just justification. Malcolm stood slowly, keeping Levi cradled in one arm. The cabin seemed to stretch longer now, every row a witness, every passenger caught in the current of unfolding consequences. He handed Levi carefully to a nearby man, an off-duty nurse who had approached quietly and murmured, "Hold him steady. Don't let him cry anymore." The man, startled, nodded, instinct taking over as he accepted the bundle. Jerome turned just in time to see Malcolm step past him. "Dr. Strain, please return to your seat," he urged, but Malcolm kept walking, each step measured, fueled by a resolve that had shed its last layer of doubt. Ross looked up. His eyes narrowed. "You gonna cry now, too?" Malcolm didn't answer. He simply stopped, reached forward with calm precision, and pressed the bloodied pencil still resting on Ross's tray back into his own hand. He turned it once, as if inspecting its balance, then lifted it in a motion that was not erratic, but surgical. The pencil plunged straight into the center of Ross's nasal bridge, angled upward with clinical force. A quiet snap echoed, not unlike the sound of a cracking knuckle, and Ross's body jolted once, then slumped backward. Blood trickled instantly, soaking into his collar, dribbling onto the tray table in slow red drops. Gasps erupted from all sides. A scream rang out. Phones captured it all. Jerome grabbed Malcolm by the shoulders, shouting, "Doctor, what have you done?" But Malcolm didn't resist. His expression didn't change. He turned his head slightly, eyes flicking to Levi, now silent, eyes wide, staring from the nurse's arms. Malcolm's voice was calm. "Corrected an error." Chaos swelled, alarms, voices, the captain's voice breaking over the intercom. But Malcolm stood rooted, a man not broken but remade, watching the pencil tremble in its final resting place, his son's injury now answered. He didn't need anyone's approval. Not anymore. Some pain doesn't just draw blood, it rewrites destiny. Jerome gripped Ross's shoulders tightly, forcing the man back into his seat with the help of another male attendant, both of them straining to restrain the flailing limbs of a man who had just stabbed a baby with a pencil. "Sit down and don't move," Jerome commanded, voice trembling from the tension but firm with training. Ross jerked once more, his breath erratic, before finally slumping back with a bitter smirk stretched across his face. The sharp odor of graphite still clung to the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent of Levi's blood. Malcolm sat frozen for a heartbeat, clutching Levi close to his chest, the baby's tiny hand wrapped in a napkin soaked through with red. Levi whimpered softly, eyes clenched tight, pain wrinkling his small face. Malcolm tried to calm his son with a quiet hum, but his own hands were trembling, not from fear, but from rage that had no outlet. The flight attendants were speaking into radios now, one of them contacting the cockpit. Malcolm heard Jerome say something about alerting authorities to meet them on the ground. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Malcolm raised his voice, calm but forceful. "He needs medical help. We need to land now." Jerome glanced over, lips parted to respond, but before he could, Ross chuckled low in his throat, then spat out, "It's just a scratch." "Don't make such a fuss." Malcolm turned his head toward him slowly, eyes narrowing. "Just a scratch." He looked down at Levi's small palm again, where the puncture wound had swollen and darkened. The napkin was no longer enough. Malcolm grabbed a fresh towel from the seat back and wrapped it tightly around the child's hand. The trembling in his fingers stopped, not from calm, but from decision. Across the aisle, some passengers stared. Others looked away in awkward silence. A few whispered to each other, voices hushed with uncertainty. One older man near the window leaned over and muttered, "These things happen. No need for drama." The words sliced deeper than the pencil had. Something shifted in Malcolm's chest. A line had been crossed, and now the world around him was treating it like spilled coffee instead of blood. The man who had harmed his child sat unbothered, and justice, real justice, seemed to be an afterthought waiting on a runway. He looked at Ross, really looked. The vein in the man's temple pulsed faintly, betraying a flicker of unease. His jaw moved as if chewing words he hadn't yet said, but the smug tilt of his chin remained. The pencil still sat on his tray table, graphite tip stained, the wood nicked from impact. A glint of that same stain, Levi's blood, caught the same light that filtered down from the overhead cabin, indifferent to all of it. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. His breath slowed. He had spent years in operating rooms, stitching together lives torn by accident, illness, and cruelty. He had held failing hearts in his hands, cut tumors from the depths of human brains, and remained calm even when death hovered inches away. But this was something medicine couldn't fix. Ross had violated something sacred. Levi whimpered again, pressing his face into his father's chest. The attendants were still speaking to the captain. Jerome was explaining the situation, requesting emergency personnel, but there was no talk of diverting. Not yet. And that meant more time for Ross to sit there, alive, breathing, proud. Malcolm stood, not abruptly, not angrily. He moved with the same grace he used before surgeries, measured, calm, aware of every motion, every eye turning toward him. Jerome didn't notice. His back was to them. The co-attendant had stepped toward the galley, retrieving a medical kit. Ross noticed. He looked up, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice dry, hesitant. Malcolm said nothing. Instead, he gently adjusted the blanket over Levi's chest, kissed the boy's forehead, and passed him softly to a young male passenger in the row behind him, who had already been watching with concern. The man caught the child gently, surprise in his eyes, but no protest. Then Malcolm turned. The aisle stretched before him like a corridor to a decision that had already been made. Ross flinched slightly in his seat, suddenly sensing something his arrogance hadn't accounted for. "Hey, now, just—" But it was too late. Malcolm moved like the surgeon he was, precise, direct, and without hesitation. His hand shot forward, seizing the pencil from the tray, and in one fluid motion he drove it upward through Ross's nasal bridge. The crunch was soft, but unmistakable. Cartilage gave way with a sickening crack, and Ross's head snapped back against the headrest. A thin line of blood streaked down his lip as his mouth opened once, soundless. Then he slumped. For a second, the plane was silent. Then screams erupted. Jerome spun around, eyes wide. "Doctor, what have you done?" he shouted, rushing forward. Malcolm didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was low but unwavering. "Corrected an error." Jerome froze in place, caught between duty and shock. Levi whimpered softly in the row behind, his small bandaged hand reaching for air. Malcolm turned to retrieve his son, but didn't move any farther. The plane erupted around him, flight attendants calling to the captain, passengers shouting, alarms beginning to sound, footsteps pounding from the galley. Still, Malcolm stood perfectly still. His breath was steady, his gaze distant. He had done what the system would not, and whatever came next, he would meet it with the same calm resolve. Every man has a limit. Malcolm had just reached his Ross opened his mouth to speak, but he never finished the sentence. Malcolm was already moving. In one fluid, controlled motion, he reached over and grasped the same pencil Ross had driven into Levi's tiny hand. The shaft was still faintly smeared with blood and graphite, trembling slightly in the crease between the tray table and the seat back pocket. Malcolm didn't hesitate. His fingers closed around the wooden barrel, his hand moving with surgical precision born from years in operating theaters, not shaking, not uncertain. Time seemed to suspend, the humming of the plane fading beneath the thundering pulse in his ears. Ross blinked, realizing too late. There was a sharp intake of breath from someone behind them, but by the time Ross lifted a hand in instinctive defense, Malcolm had already stepped in. With calm fury, he drove the pencil upward, angling it cleanly through the narrow cartilage space at the base of Ross's nose. There was a sickening crunch, subtle but final, the sound of fragile bone yielding beneath practiced pressure. Ross gasped, a brief, wet sound that ended in a strangled choke. His eyes rolled back, body going slack. Blood spilled quickly, soaking the collar of his shirt and streaking the back of the seat in jagged lines. He slumped sideways, unmoving, his face grotesquely frozen mid-expression, somewhere between disbelief and agony. Chaos erupted. A scream rang out from somewhere behind them. A tray clattered to the floor. Passengers leapt up from their seats, some clutching armrests, others fumbling for phones or ducking instinctively. The overhead lights seemed to buzz louder, casting flickering halos that turned the scene into a surreal tableau. A baby cried in row 14. Someone shouted, "He's killed him!" But the words were lost in the growing surge of panic. Jerome, the flight attendant, rushed down the aisle, his shoes skidding slightly on the carpet. His eyes locked onto the scene. Ross bleeding. Malcolm standing still with the pencil still clutched loosely in his hand. "Doctor, what have you done?" Jerome's voice cracked with disbelief as he crouched beside the unconscious man. Malcolm didn't move. He slowly turned his head, eyes dark but calm, the adrenaline leaving his limbs stiff and electric. His voice came out steady, hollow, like a bell ringing far off in a storm. "Corrected an error." Around him, the world fractured. An elderly man dropped his paperback. A younger passenger in a leather jacket muttered, "Call the pilot," while another scrambled for the emergency call button above his head. The cabin filled with overlapping noise, whispers, alarms, instructions shouted from the galley. The calm orderliness of the flight had dissolved into something feral and unpredictable. But Malcolm stood still. His thoughts were not on the noise, not even on the hands that would surely come to restrain him. His gaze was fixed on the row across the aisle, where Levi whimpered softly in his seat. The gauze around the child's hand had loosened, stained red at the edge. His small chest rose and fell in shallow, shivering breaths. A male attendant named Grant approached from the rear, his voice raised. "We need a first aid kit. Get that man stabilized." But even as he reached Ross, he hesitated, uncertain whether to help or restrain. The passengers parted just enough for him to move forward, and in that narrow aisle Malcolm could feel the tension gathering like static electricity. He wasn't thinking about what would happen next. He wasn't thinking about courtrooms, laws, or consequences. He thought only of the moment Ross's hand had moved toward his child, the moment pain bloomed across Levi's palm, the look in Ross's eyes, not regret, but pride. He had crossed a line, and now, so had Malcolm. Blood dripped from the pencil's tip onto the carpet, forming tiny red drops that marked the end of restraint and the beginning of something irreversible. Jerome turned toward the cockpit, shouting instructions, his voice strained. "We need to inform the captain now. Lockdown protocol, right now." Malcolm lowered the pencil slowly, letting it drop to the floor with a faint clink. He raised his hands, empty, motionless, as if to say, "I'm done." His face remained impassive, but his eyes shimmered with something deeper: exhaustion, fury, release. No one dared approach him yet. The other flight attendant, still hesitating near the curtain, kept glancing between Ross's crumpled body and Malcolm's upright posture, as if trying to decide who the real threat was. And in the center of it all, Levi let out a quiet sob, drawing Malcolm's gaze like a tether. His son was alive. His son was safe. For now, that was enough. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain's voice echoed through the overhead speaker, ordering passengers to remain seated and calm. But calm had become a memory now, something left behind at 30,000 feet, just before everything changed. Malcolm closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, he felt as though he were watching himself from outside his own body. A distant witness to the moment he stopped being just a father or a doctor and became something else. He turned to face the front of the plane as if preparing to walk into whatever storm waited ahead. Justice had finally found altitude. The first scream had barely died out when the captain's voice erupted over the intercom. "All passengers, remain seated. Flight crew, secure the cabin immediately." The command cut through the panic like a scalpel. Passengers froze, mid-scream, mid-movement. The air turned razor-thin with shock as the reality settled. Something irreversible had just occurred. Two male flight attendants, Merrick and Soren, rushed toward row 14, where Ross's body slumped awkwardly against the seat, blood trailing from beneath his nose like a crimson vine. Malcolm stood next to him, unmoving, the pencil still gripped loosely in his hand, though its brutal work was done. "Sir, put the object down now," Merrick ordered, voice firm but laced with fear. Malcolm let the pencil fall to the floor without resistance, the faint clatter barely audible beneath the resumed cries of a few stunned passengers. As Soren retrieved zip ties from the emergency drawer, Malcolm raised his hands calmly. "No need to force me." "I won't resist," he said, his voice clinical, detached, like he was still wearing his lab coat in an operating room. Meanwhile, Jerome scrambled toward the overhead cabinet to retrieve the emergency medical kit. His fingers fumbled with the latch before yanking it open and tossing gauze and antiseptics toward Merrick. "Is Ross breathing?" Soren asked, crouching beside the injured man. Jerome leaned in, his hand trembling as he checked the side of Ross's neck. Pulse, still faint, shallow breathing. He's alive. But he's going into shock. Malcolm, now kneeling with his hands bound tightly behind his back, turned his head slightly, not toward Ross, but toward his son. Across the aisle, a young man in a navy windbreaker had stepped forward amidst the chaos. He was no taller than Malcolm, his face pale, eyes wide behind square glasses. "I've got him," the man said softly. Levi, whimpering and half asleep in terror, was tucked gently into the arms of this stranger. The baby's tiny fingers, wrapped in gauze from the earlier attack, clung reflexively to the fabric of the man's jacket. The man's name was Adrian Lowe, a journalist returning home after 3 weeks covering a workers' strike in the Northeast. Quiet by nature, Adrian had kept to himself until now, but something about the doctor's eyes, the storm brewing behind them, the protective instinct pulsing like a second heartbeat, had compelled him to act. "You're safe now," Adrian whispered into the infant's ear, his own voice cracking under the weight of the moment. His hands trembled, but he held Levi close, shielding the child from the growing circle of strangers. The co-pilot entered the cabin seconds later, eyes scanning the scene. Blood, bindings, panic, silence. The cockpit had warned him of a physical altercation, but this was more than that. This was a reckoning mid-air. "Who's responsible?" he asked sharply. Jerome, still kneeling beside Ross, nodded toward Malcolm. "He acted after Ross stabbed the baby. He's the one who attacked first. We all saw it." The co-pilot looked down at Ross's barely conscious form, then at the quiet man in restraints. Malcolm's face revealed nothing, no remorse, no fury, only the steady calm of a man who had decided long ago how far he'd go to protect what mattered. The co-pilot nodded once and returned to the flight deck. Moments later, the captain's voice returned, this time lower, almost grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, for safety and medical reasons, we are diverting to Varon City Airfield. Please remain calm and seated until further notice." The hum of the engines shifted subtly as the plane adjusted course. Outside the windows, thick clouds began to gather like bruises across the sky. Inside the cabin, the adrenaline slowly drained, leaving behind silence thick with judgment and uncertainty. Passengers whispered among themselves. Some stared at Malcolm with something like awe. Others eyed him with fear. No one approached. Adrian sat down in an empty seat across the aisle. Levi nestled against his chest, gently bouncing to soothe the child's quiet sobs. Malcolm turned his gaze to them, not with sadness, but with the aching relief of a father who knew his son was safe for now. Jerome crouched again, now beside Malcolm, and reached out to check the baby's injured hand, perhaps out of genuine concern. But Malcolm's voice stopped him mid-motion. "Be careful," he said quietly, eyes locked with Jerome's. "He's hurt enough today." Jerome nodded, withdrawing his hand respectfully. For the first time since boarding, he looked at Malcolm not as a passenger, not even as a suspect, but as a father. Outside, the first gusts of storm wind slammed against the fuselage, rocking the aircraft gently. In the distance, the faint flicker of lightning carved jagged silhouettes into the sky. Inside, time seemed to pause again. "Sometimes," Malcolm said to no one in particular, "truth survives between the noise and the sirens." The plane jolted violently as turbulence slammed through the fuselage, rattling the overhead compartments and eliciting startled gasps from the passengers. Seatbelt signs blinked with urgency, and a grim silence settled over the cabin. Outside, the storm had fully arrived, black clouds churning, streaks of lightning slicing through the sky like fractures in the atmosphere. The descent into Varan City had begun. Malcolm Strain remained seated, hands loosely clenched in his lap, flanked by two vigilant male attendants. The plastic zip ties bit into his wrists, but he didn't flinch. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, unblinking. His thoughts moved like a carousel of quiet fury and calculation. He replayed every second, the moment Ross had drawn the pencil, the shriek of his son, the blood, the judgment he had delivered with surgical clarity. There was no regret, only the gnawing question of whether justice would be seen or buried beneath procedure and perception. Behind him, passengers whispered in divided tones. Some regarded Malcolm with awe, as a father who did what no court could do in time. Others averted their eyes, whispering about unhinged behavior, about lines that shouldn't have been crossed. The turbulence made their conversations feel more volatile, as if the plane itself shared the weight of uncertainty. Ross stirred. A weak, wet cough escaped his blood-caked lips. He was conscious, barely. His swollen face lolled to one side, smearing red across the fabric of the seat. A low, incoherent mumble left his mouth. It might have been a name, or just breath. One of the attendants turned briefly to check on him, then snapped his gaze back to Malcolm. But Malcolm was already watching, his expression unreadable. His lips didn't move, but in his mind, a single thought repeated, "You're still breathing. What now?" Adrian Lowe sat a few rows back, eyes narrowed behind wire-rimmed glasses. The journalist's camera phone was resting subtly on his tray table, capturing the events with calm precision. Every gesture, every movement, the cabin crew's restraint, the captain's radioed updates, the passengers' reactions, he documented it all. Not for spectacle, but for truth. He spoke quietly to himself, almost like a prayer. People will want the truth. Not a headline. The truth. The plane shook again, harder this time. Gasps and startled shouts rippled through the cabin. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. From the cockpit, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, taut but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your belts fastened. We are preparing for an emergency landing at Varan City Airfield due to an onboard medical incident. Emergency personnel will meet us on arrival." Malcolm turned slightly, just enough to glimpse the window beside him. Flashes of red and white strobed across the tarmac below. Emergency vehicles already in position, waiting like vultures or guardians. The contrast was striking. Inside the cabin, chaos lived in whispers and held breath. Outside, order waited with sirens and blinking lights. Ross shifted again, a gurgled word falling from his lips. He didn't stop. One of the attendants moved to silence him, but Malcolm spoke for the first time since the altercation. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of stone. "Let him speak." The attendant paused, thrown off by the steadiness in Malcolm's tone. Ross's eyes fluttered. Whatever he had left to say faded into a groan. Malcolm exhaled slowly, then looked down at the faint smears of blood drying on his shirt sleeve. His mind wasn't in the cabin anymore. It was with Levi, somewhere at the front, in the arms of another man, being carried by strangers down a stormlit runway. Was his son crying? Cold? Afraid? The thought tore deeper than any legal accusation ever could. Adrian noticed the shift. He leaned toward a nearby passenger. "You see what's happening, right? This doesn't end with an arrest. It started somewhere bigger, and it's not over." The man beside him didn't respond. He just nodded, eyes glued to the front where Malcolm sat motionless. The wheels of the plane touched down hard, slamming into the soaked tarmac with a force that rattled the entire frame. Screeches of rubber on wet concrete echoed through the fuselage. A collective breath was held as the aircraft slowed, the nose dipping slightly as it rolled toward the waiting storm of flashing lights. Cabin lights flickered again. Outside, rain sheeted against the windows in sideways torrents, briefly lit by staccato lightning. Through the haze, silhouettes of paramedics and officers could be seen gathering with stretchers, radios crackling, their movements urgent and choreographed. Inside, time slowed. Malcolm lifted his head just slightly, listening to the rising noise of the landing gear winding down and the low murmur of panicked breath around him. No one spoke. Everyone waited, some for accountability, others for release. And in that suspended moment, as the plane hissed to a halt and the doors prepared to open, Malcolm's gaze returned to Ross one last time. The man's eyes were closed again, face slack, but the damage was clear. Yet so was the truth. Justice had arrived, but not cleanly. Not by law or by procedure, by instinct, by necessity, by a father who had reached his threshold. Outside, the storm still raged. The moment justice lands, mercy often takes flight. Rain struck the aircraft windows in erratic rhythms as the emergency hatch swung open. The moment the wheels locked into place, a flood of motion surged into the cabin. Uniformed responders swept in, paramedics, airport security, federal air marshals, each moving with rigid urgency. The air smelled of damp upholstery and blood. The passengers shrank back as authority took over. "Step away from the child," one responder ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. Malcolm didn't resist. Gently, he handed Levi into the arms of a young male medic who barely looked old enough to shave. Levi whimpered, his fingers twitching under the bandages, but his cries had faded into a sleepy, confused moan. The medic wrapped him in a thermal blanket and cradled him carefully as he turned toward the rear of the plane. "Where are you taking him?" Malcolm asked, voice calm but edged with steel. "For immediate medical evaluation," the medic answered. "Pediatric team's already on standby." Malcolm gave a tight nod, his expression unreadable as the child disappeared down the aisle and out of view. Behind him, two officers approached. One read from a small notepad, the other unhooked a set of metal cuffs. "Dr. Malcolm Strain," the taller officer said, "you are hereby placed under arrest for aggravated assault aboard a federal aircraft. You have the right to remain silent." The words blurred slightly in Malcolm's ears. His mind held only the image of Levi, bandaged, trembling, silent. The click of the cuffs was sharp, too loud in the thick air. It felt less like punishment and more like a ritual, something long expected but still unjust. "Wait," Jerome Pike's voice cut in. The flight attendant stepped forward, glancing between the officers and Malcolm. "You don't understand. He was defending his child." Ross stabbed that baby first. "There are witnesses." The officer didn't even turn. "Noted. This'll be sorted through the proper channels." "That baby was bleeding," Jerome continued, eyes pleading. "There has to be room for context." "Then let the court sort out the context," the other officer replied flatly, motioning for Malcolm to stand. Adrian Lowe emerged from the crowd, laptop under one arm, a flash drive in the other. His face was pale but resolute. "I have something," he said, approaching a security agent. This is what really happened." The officer hesitated. "What is it?" "A recording," Adrian replied. "I filmed the whole thing, Ross stabbing the child, Malcolm's reaction. You'll want this." His voice cracked slightly as he handed over the drive. The officer accepted it, expression hard to read, and tucked it into a sealed evidence pouch without comment. Behind them, another paramedic team was lifting Ross Denning onto a stretcher. His face was slick with blood, now partially dried and darkening. He groaned softly, one eye swollen shut, his hands twitching involuntarily as if still grappling with phantoms only he could see. Malcolm was led down the aisle, past passengers who didn't meet his gaze. Some stared into their laps. Others peeked through the slits of their fingers. The rain had intensified outside, drumming against the fuselage like the ticking of an unseen clock. The stairway down from the aircraft was slick with water. Each step Malcolm took echoed with finality. The cuffs were tight, biting into his wrists, but he held his head high. Lightning arced across the sky, illuminating the airfield in a flash of white. In that split second, everything looked suspended, like a photograph of justice frozen mid-motion. At the base of the stairs, Lieutenant Brent Norrick waited beneath a black umbrella, his uniform soaked at the shoulders. "Transport's ready," he said. "We'll process him at the airport facility." Malcolm didn't acknowledge him. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the ambulance that had taken Levi. In the back of the second ambulance, Ross stirred faintly. His lips parted, and a paramedic leaned closer to listen. He wasn't wrong," Ross rasped. The paramedic blinked, unsure if he'd heard it or imagined it. By the time he looked again, Ross had slipped back into unconsciousness. No one wrote the words down. They were never added to the official report. Sometimes confessions dissolve in the rain before anyone hears them. He drove a pencil through a baby's palm, laughing as blood trickled down those tiny fingers. If you believe cruelty must always face consequence, hit subscribe now, because silence only feeds the monsters among us. The door slammed shut behind Malcolm with a mechanical finality, locking him inside a small, sterile room. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting an unforgiving white glare that washed the color from everything, including Malcolm's face. He sat at the metal table, wrists still sore from the earlier cuffs, though now unbound. His gray shirt was rumpled from the handling of airport security, and dried streaks of Levi's blood still clung faintly to the fabric. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old air, a place where stories were often told but rarely believed. Across from him sat investigator Colin Drax, a man in his mid-40s with a heavy brow and the lean posture of someone who didn't waste words or time. He folded his hands on the table slowly, eyes sharp but unreadable, as though constantly weighing whether he was speaking to a suspect or a survivor. "You're a surgeon, Dr. Strain," Drax began, his voice low and clipped, each syllable shaped with precision. "You know how fragile the human body is, so why use lethal force?" Malcolm's eyes didn't flinch. He met the investigator's gaze without hesitation, but his voice, when it came, was quiet, nearly a whisper. "Because reason doesn't stop cruelty. It only survives it." Drax leaned back slightly, not from surprise but calculation. He tapped his pen once against the manila folder in front of him. "Interesting answer," he muttered before reaching forward and clicking a remote. A small screen to the side of the wall came to life, casting moving shadows onto the white walls. The video played. Adrian's recording. The cabin. The cries. The pencil. The lunge. The sound of Levi's scream filled the room like a ghost, raw and haunting. Drax didn't look at the screen. He watched Malcolm instead. Watched how he didn't blink. Watched how his jaw locked when Ross's sneer played across the footage. Watched how his breath caught when the moment of the stabbing replayed in slow motion. Malcolm's hand seizing the pencil. The precise upward drive. The collapse. When the video ended, silence reclaimed the room, heavy and alive. Drax exhaled, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "This will go to court," he said slowly, "but the context might save you." Malcolm nodded once, barely. His thoughts were elsewhere, on a hospital cot perhaps, where Levi's hand was being cleaned and bandaged by strangers. On the moment, Ross had whispered that the boy needed discipline. On how no amount of courtroom logic could undo what had been done to a child who barely knew the world yet. Outside the room, the world was already moving faster than either of them realized. An anonymous video upload hit the internet just an hour after the plane landed. Titled, "Father Protects Infant Mid-Flight," the clip began gaining traction almost immediately. Adrian Lowe's voice could be heard at the start, saying, "I don't think anyone's going to believe this unless I show it." Then the chaos unfolded. Ross's aggression, Malcolm's restraint, and the moment justice erupted. Comment sections flooded with reactions: anger, disbelief, support, debate. News anchors scrambled to get early footage. Social media trended the phrase, "Protect Black children," within hours. But nothing spread faster than one image: the freeze frame of Malcolm shielding Levi in his arms, blood on his shirt, calm in his eyes. At Crestlane Airways headquarters, a statement was drafted hastily. It read, "We condemn all forms of violence on our aircraft. Passenger safety remains our top priority." The statement offered no apology, no admission of failure, just corporate distance dressed in polished grammar. Yet no one noticed the statement as much as they noticed its absence of heart. Inside the holding facility, Malcolm remained seated. Drax stepped out briefly, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the echo of fluorescent hum. Malcolm reached into his jacket where a pocket had been torn during the struggle. His fingers brushed against the small hospital bracelet he'd taken from Levi's wrist earlier, the one that read, "Infant Strain, Levi, L, Wing 6. He pressed it between his palms and closed his eyes. The door reopened, Drax returning with a file under his arm. "The video's gone public," he said without needing to clarify which video. "It changes things." Malcolm didn't speak. Drax softened just slightly. "You might not be the one on trial after all." But Malcolm knew better. In the court of public opinion, in the system that often failed to differentiate between defense and defiance, he would always be on trial, for being a protector who acted, for being a father who chose action over diplomacy. Outside, reporters swarmed the terminal. One microphone caught a passenger from the flight whispering, "He didn't snap. He saved that baby." News tickers began rolling the story live. Doctor detains violent passenger mid-flight. Video sparks outcry. Others were more cautious. Violence in the skies? Did a father go too far? But through all the noise, one phrase began rising above the rest. It wasn't from a court document or a statement. It came from a stranger's caption on a viral clip. It read, "When justice bleeds, the world pays attention." And as if echoing the truth louder than any verdict, the final line whispered across screens worldwide. Truth had taken flight before anyone could cage it. The courtroom air felt electric, humming with hushed voices and the frenzied scratching of reporters' pens. Cameras clicked in rapid succession as Dr. Malcolm Strain stepped through the double doors, escorted by a marshal in navy blues. His gray suit, neatly pressed and understated, did nothing to hide the quiet storm behind his eyes. He walked with the calm of a man who had held a dying heart in his hands, but today he wasn't saving a life. He was defending one. A sea of unfamiliar faces watched him cross the floor: journalists, activists, curious citizens. Somewhere in the crowd sat Jerome Pike, the flight attendant who had witnessed everything. Near the back, Adrian Lowe adjusted his camera lens, the faint red light blinking as it recorded the proceedings. Not for drama, but for truth. "State versus Dr. Malcolm Strain," the court clerk announced. The gavel dropped like a sharp heartbeat. The prosecutor, a tall man with slicked back hair and a voice like a scalpel, stood confidently. "Your Honor, we present clear evidence that the defendant, unprovoked and enraged, delivered a near-lethal blow to another passenger. His occupation as a surgeon only confirms he knew exactly how to inflict maximum damage." Malcolm sat still, his expression unreadable. His lawyer, Elias Kent, rose slowly, hands folded behind his back. "The defense will prove that Dr. Strain acted under extreme provocation, not out of rage, but in protection of his infant son, after an unthinkable act of violence was committed against a defenseless child mid-flight," the courtroom murmured. The judge, a silver-haired man with weary eyes, raised a hand for silence. But it was Adrian's footage that shifted the atmosphere entirely. On screen, Grainy video captured the cabin's fluorescent lighting, the uneasy hum of the engines, and then Ross Denning's hand, fast and sharp, driving the pencil into Levi's palm. The baby's scream echoed from the speakers like a living wound. Gasps filled the room. Then came Malcolm's voice on tape, calm, steady. "It's okay, son. I've got you." The footage continued. Passengers panicked, some frozen in shock. Ross sneered his infamous line. He needed to learn discipline. Another gasp. Malcolm rose. The footage showed him move forward, slowly, deliberately, eyes locked on Ross. No hesitation, no rage, only clarity. The moment of impact was blurred, but the sharp gasp, Ross's collapse, and Malcolm's stillness said everything. When the video ended, silence lingered. Not a word, not a cough. Then Elias spoke again. This was not a moment of madness. This was a line crossed too many times. This was a father acting when no one else did. Before the prosecution could respond, a bailiff approached the bench with a sealed envelope. The judge opened it, brow furrowing. He read its contents, then handed it silently to both attorneys. Elias read aloud, eyes narrowing. "Your Honor, this is the forensic analysis of Mr. Denning's clothing, recovered at the hospital." A small capsule was discovered in the inner lining of his jacket. Upon testing, it was found to contain traces of norexidrine X murmurs rippled through the room. The prosecutor stood. "That compound was banned over a decade ago." "Correct," Elias continued, "because of its association with heightened aggression, hallucinations, and impulsive behavior. The dosage found was consistent with a slow-dissolving stimulant. Ross Denning's blood work confirms he had ingested it, likely without his knowledge." The judge sat back, lips pressed into a hard line. "Are you suggesting Mr. Denning was drugged before the incident?" "We are, Your Honor," Elias said, "and if we follow that thread, the implications go beyond this courtroom." Someone wanted this outcome. Perhaps not the specifics, but the conflict. The prosecutor scrambled. Even if drugged, Dr. Strain used lethal force. No, Elias cut in firmly. He used medical precision. And Ross Denning survived. That pencil was the same weapon used to injure a child. Malcolm neutralized a threat when no one else did. The judge turned toward Malcolm for the first time since the trial began. "Do you have anything to say, Dr. Strain?" Malcolm stood slowly. His voice was soft, but carried clearly. "I didn't board that plane to hurt anyone. But when I saw what he did to my son, I knew he wasn't going to stop, not unless someone made him. I didn't choose this, but I'll take responsibility for it." The judge nodded, expression unreadable. Suddenly, Adrian stood and asked for permission to submit one last clip, only seconds long. The screen flickered again. It showed Ross Denning, barely conscious on a stretcher, whispering through bloodied lips, He saved that kid from me." The impact was immediate. A deep, almost reverent silence fell. The jury glanced at one another, shaken. Even the judge paused before speaking. "This court will review the medical report in full and issue a decision regarding continued prosecution," he said. "But I will say this. Sometimes justice reveals itself not in who strikes first, but in who chooses to protect when all others fail." Reporters raced to update their headlines. And just as Malcolm sat down beside his attorney again, the courtroom's atmosphere subtly shifted. Not exoneration. Not yet. But a window cracked open, just enough for something more human than law. Understanding. Every storm hides a second lightning strike waiting to reveal its true source. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the technician took the stand, his badge number replaced with a placeholder name to protect his identity. A hush swept through the room, as though everyone present sensed something critical was about to surface. The technician, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and hollow eyes, spoke into the microphone with a voice low but firm. I worked at Halden Dynamics for 6 years. I was part of their chemical testing division before the layoffs started, before things got unethical. The prosecutor adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. What do you mean by unethical, Mr. Reed? They started calling them behavioral response evaluations, the technician said, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. But they weren't monitored trials. They were unauthorized. We called them ghost tests. Untraceable. No documentation. Subjects would be chosen from public spaces, conferences, flights, even medical facilities, and given small doses of experimental compounds through everyday items. In exchange, they'd receive travel perks. They were never told the truth. Malcolm sat in the gallery, his eyes unmoving, the words sinking like stones into his chest. He looked down at his son's hand, now lightly bandaged, small fingers twitching in sleep beside him. Adrian Lowe, seated a few rows behind, continued jotting rapid notes, his brow furrowed, camera slung low around his shoulder, forgotten for the moment. The courtroom projector flickered to life. A blurry security photo displayed Ross Denning at a Halden Dynamics orientation event from 3 years prior. A younger version of the man stood in front of a booth marked Cognitive Stability Research. The tagline behind him read, "Tomorrow's Science, Today's Insight." Whispers spread through the courtroom. Judge Keller tapped his gavel once, restoring order. The defense attorney rose. "Your Honor, we move to submit this as evidence that Mr. Denning was not only previously associated with Halden Dynamics, but may have been unknowingly participating in one of these ghost trials." The prosecution hesitated, eyes narrowed. "We'll need confirmation this isn't speculative," but the technician leaned forward. "He wasn't the only one. I packed some of those capsules myself. I remember that lining. It was used for slow absorption and concealment. Once body heat activated the seal, the chemical was released. Subtle, invisible to most screenings." Was Ross Denning aware he had been selected for one of these trials? The judge asked, voice grave. "I doubt it," the man said, shaking his head. "Most weren't. Some complained of headaches, rage episodes, memory gaps. Some were just labeled as unstable passengers when they snapped in public." Gasps echoed. The air inside the courtroom grew heavier, as though the ceiling had sunk several inches lower. Malcolm's breathing slowed. Every word was like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Ross's twitching hands, the sudden outburst, the dead-eyed violence that had seemed so misplaced for a mere complaint, the pencil, Levi's scream, the dismissiveness. All of it painted a picture of a man triggered into something monstrous, not by choice, but by science gone rogue. Adrian leaned forward, whispering into his recorder. "Confirmed. Bioengineering firm responsible for behavior-altering tests aboard commercial flights. Public safety breached. Victims include minors." The judge turned to the lead investigator, who stood beside the evidence table. "Have you tested the residue in Mr. Denning's bloodstream?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "Preliminary toxicology confirms traces of neuroxin-13, a compound outlawed 5 years ago for inducing severe paranoia and aggression. Known side effects include disassociation, auditory hallucinations, and impulsive violence. Dosage detected in Mr. Denning was consistent with experimental exposure." A cold silence blanketed the courtroom. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, then opened them slowly, filled with the hollow realization that his instincts had been right. But the truth was darker than he had imagined. This wasn't just about a man losing control. This was about systems engineered to break human minds and pretend it was coincidence. "Do we know how widespread this is?" the prosecutor asked quietly. The technician swallowed hard. "There have been over 30 similar incidents across different airlines in the past year, each dismissed as isolated violence. But the flight logs and passenger manifests align. Same cities, same names behind the ticket purchases. It's all connected." The courtroom burst into murmurs again, reporters rushing out with fresh headlines to upload. Judge Keller raised a hand. I am ordering an immediate inquiry into Halden Dynamics and all related subsidiaries. Until such time, this case cannot proceed as a standard criminal trial. The gavel came down once, heavy with finality. Malcolm rose to his feet slowly, Levi now awake in his arms, blinking sleepily. He looked at the judge, the investigators, the rows of people whose opinions had swung wildly from judgment to sympathy. But his thoughts were only of Levi's safety. The courtroom, the inquiries, the headlines, none of it mattered more than that tiny hand holding his shirt collar. Outside, federal agents were already swarming the local Halden offices. Warrants were being served, files shredded, some too late. A deeper rot had been uncovered, and Malcolm knew the battle had only begun. As he walked slowly down the courthouse steps, Adrian caught up beside him. They'll want interviews. TV spots. You're at the center of something massive now. Malcolm didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the horizon, gray clouds rolling in. I'm not here to be famous, he finally said. I'm here to make sure no one else bleeds because of a secret someone hid behind a lab coat. Behind them, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing like lightning in a gathering storm. Sometimes evil hides in paperwork, not people. Ross Denning awoke with a gasp, sweat trickling down his temples despite the sterile chill of the hospital room. The ceiling above him was a dull gray tile, unmoving and silent, yet it seemed to pulse with fragments of memory that refused to settle. His wrists itched beneath the soft restraints looped over the sides of the hospital bed, standard procedure for patients under police supervision. An IV line ran into his left arm, pumping a slow drip of clear fluid, while a small monitor beeped steadily behind him, echoing in the corners of the quiet room. His eyes darted from the pale walls to the single chair near the window, where a uniformed officer sat reading a file. The man's eyes flicked up as Ross stirred. "You're awake," the officer said, his voice low and measured, as if addressing something dangerous that had begun to stir. "Took you long enough?" Ross's mouth was dry, his throat rough. "What? Where am I?" His voice cracked, but the fear behind it was unmistakable. "Varan General," the officer replied. "You've been out for 2 weeks. You were found unconscious on a plane, after an altercation. We had to wait for you to come around. Charges are pending, but let's see what your memory brings first." Ross blinked rapidly, his mind a shattered mirror trying to piece itself back together. Images began to flicker, too fast, too jagged. A white lab coat, a gloved hand, a metal vial. A whisper. "This won't hurt a bit, Mr. Denning. Just keep calm and follow protocol." His body jerked slightly at the memory, the officer rising to his feet in a flash, hand resting near his belt. "No," Ross said hoarsely, shaking his head. "I remember. Someone gave me something. A vial. Before the flight. They said it was part of a response evaluation." The officer stiffened. "What kind of vial?" Ross's fingers twitched involuntarily at his sides. "Clear. Small. They said it was approved. Said I was helping with aviation stress studies. I've done some volunteer work before, nothing unusual, but this time something wasn't right." The door opened and a tall, neatly dressed man in a charcoal suit stepped in. His badge identified him as Investigator Marshall Klein. He nodded at the officer and then turned to Ross, studying him with the sharpness of a man used to finding lies in shadows. "I'm Klein. I need to know exactly what you remember about that vial," he said, setting a recorder gently on the table beside the bed. "This isn't a small matter anymore." Ross hesitated, shame flickering behind his eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't even know I had." Not until now, Klein opened a folder and pulled out a photograph, Levi's bandaged hand, delicate and trembling. He laid it face up on Ross's chest. Ross's breath hitched. He stared at the image, his chest rising and falling faster. "A baby," he whispered. "That's— No. No, I wouldn't. I couldn't." "But you did," Klein said evenly. "Stabbed him with a pencil. Unprovoked. You were restrained, unconscious by the time we landed. You've been under supervision since Ross closed his eyes, as if doing so might blot out the image and the shame that now weighed heavier than the restraints. I remember being angry. But it wasn't mine. It felt like my thoughts weren't mine. Like something had climbed inside and twisted them." Klein leaned forward, his voice low. "Would you be willing to testify to that in court?" Ross opened his eyes again, and for the first time since waking, there was a spark of purpose. "Yes. I want to testify. I need to tell the truth, whatever's left of it." The courtroom was packed by the time Ross's appearance was confirmed. News had already leaked that a major twist was expected in the Strain case, and every bench was filled. Malcolm sat quietly at the front, Levi asleep against his chest, while his attorney whispered updates beside him. Adrian stood a few feet back, camera lowered, notebook tucked beneath his arm, sensing that this day would change everything. Ross entered the courtroom escorted by 2 guards. His face was pale, gaunt from recovery, but his expression was resolute. He was sworn in and took the stand, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He looked straight at Malcolm. "I didn't come here for forgiveness," he began, "but I need to speak plainly. I was approached weeks before the flight by men representing a company called Halden Dynamics. I used to work in their illustration division, but they told me they'd shifted into stress response testing and were recruiting former employees. They offered me a stipend, a one-way flight, and asked me to take a supplement just before boarding. I didn't ask questions. I was desperate for work." He swallowed hard. "But after I drank it, things changed. I remember irritability, heat in my skull, a kind of tunnel vision. The smallest sound felt unbearable. The baby's cry. It triggered something in me that I didn't recognize. It felt like someone else was driving. The room sat frozen. Even the prosecutor lowered his pen. The judge, a stoic man named Herrick Lane, leaned forward. "Are you saying you were under the influence of a substance that altered your mental state?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ross said, nodding. "And I have no excuse, but I need the court to know. I never wanted to hurt anyone. And if Dr. Strain hadn't stopped me, I think it would have gotten worse. Much worse." There was a long silence. Then the prosecutor stood, cleared his throat, and said, "The state is willing to reconsider the charges against Dr. Strain under the clause of justified self-defense, given this sworn testimony and corroborating toxicology reports." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm didn't move. He simply tightened his grip on Levi. When the judge announced the dismissal of all charges, applause broke out among the observers. But Malcolm didn't celebrate. He stood slowly, nodded to his attorney, and walked out without a word. Adrian followed moments later, catching up with him in the hall. "They dropped the charges," Adrian said softly. "I heard," Malcolm replied, voice low. "That doesn't mean it's over." As they walked through the marble corridor, a court assistant ran past them holding a fax. A nearby reporter caught sight of it, snatching a glimpse. "Halden Dynamics, offices cleared out overnight," the reporter murmured. "Executives vanished." Servers wiped. Malcolm paused. His jaw clenched. "When the guilty disappear," he said, almost to himself, "truth lingers like smoke in a closed room." Malcolm sat alone in the break room, the hum of the vending machine buzzing in the corner like static in his brain. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow across the linoleum floor as he stared at the untouched cup of tea on the table in front of him. He was back at Easton Memorial, wearing the same white coat with his name stitched neatly on the pocket, but something inside him had shifted permanently. The halls hadn't changed. The surgical board still glowed with its rotating list of procedures. The nurses still smiled politely. The residents still whispered when he walked by. But Malcolm Strain no longer felt like a man returning to routine. He felt like a man returning from war. He had declined the directorship of neurosurgery twice. The hospital board didn't understand. "You have public support," they'd argued. "You've become a symbol." But Malcolm wasn't interested in symbols. He was interested in prevention, in systems that protected the innocent, in ensuring no father would ever again have to choose between the law and his child's safety. So, he founded the Levi Trust. It started in a modest office 2 blocks from the hospital, just Malcolm, a volunteer caseworker named Nolan Price, and a legal advisor he had known since his residency, Dr. Kareem Holt. They took on cases no one else would: children hurt by defective treatments, families misled by experimental drug trials, patients discarded by corporate insurance schemes. Malcolm worked with a quiet intensity, each decision informed by the haunting memory of that flight, the weight of his son's bleeding hand, the cold precision of the pencil he had driven into another man's face. Outside the office, the world hadn't forgotten. Adrian Lowe's exposé on Halden Dynamics had gone viral. Titled "Injected Fury, a Corporate Flight Risk," it won the Northam Prize for Investigative Journalism. Adrian had visited Malcolm once, notebook in hand, expecting a quote, a reflective statement. Instead, Malcolm had led him to a glass cabinet in the corner of the office. Inside it, resting on a velvet cloth, was the pencil. Unsharpened, cleaned, sealed in a narrow tube. "I kept it," Malcolm had said, his voice low but firm. "Not as a weapon." As a reminder, Adrian had nodded, closing his notebook without writing a word. He understood. Ross Denning, now living under supervised psychiatric care in a federal rehabilitation center, had written to Malcolm once. The envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday, its corners damp and smudged. Malcolm read it, standing by the window, Levi playing softly behind him with plastic blocks. The letter was short, the handwriting jagged and uncertain. It described fragments of memory, voices that weren't his own, and a hollow feeling of losing control. It ended with a single, trembling line. "Whatever I became that day wasn't me, but your mercy still saved me." Malcolm folded the letter carefully, walked to his study and placed it in his desk drawer, beside the pencil. That night, as the sky turned a soft indigo and the hum of the city dulled into silence, Malcolm sat on the floor of his small home, holding Levi in his lap. The boy was laughing. Pure, unfiltered joy, his tiny fingers gripping his father's thumb. Malcolm watched him, the corners of his lips lifting in a slow, tired smile. He didn't think about the trial anymore, or the camera flashes, or the faces in the courtroom. He thought only of this moment, this warmth, this second chance. And as Levi leaned back into his chest, giggling at nothing, Malcolm whispered softly, more to himself than the boy, "Some scars fade, but their lessons never do." He pierced a child's flesh for amusement, and felt the same steel break through his pride moments later. If you believe justice must strike back for the voiceless, subscribe now. The innocent will never bleed alone. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It confronts the realities of racism, violence, and the pain caused by prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, evoke empathy, and inspire dialogue about justice, accountability, and protecting the innocent from hate.